There was little question that I was a huge Jurassic Park fan when it first came out. Not only did the movie bring to life just about every dinosaur fantasy I'd had since I was a kid, but it also opened the floodgates for Jurassic Park video games to come out on basically every single console that was available at the time. I was totally okay with this and was itching to see what they could make on the Super NES, which was my console of choice. Though I was more than aware even then that movies turned into video games were usually terrible, I still had my hopes up for Jurassic Park. I mean, how hard could it be to truly fuck up a video game about shooting rampaging dinosaurs? Thankfully, the game ended up being pretty great, even if it wasn't at all what anyone was actually expecting it to be. Jurassic Park on the Super NES decided not to go for the obvious side-scrolling action game that everyone on Earth was doing on the other consoles, and instead opted for an overhead Zelda-like adventure game. That was actually pretty shocking to see the first time you loaded up the game. Instead of running and gunning through hordes of dinosaurs, this was a slower, more plotting game, filled with exploration and puzzles and dungeons. While the initial shock of the game not being an action game kinda put me off at first, it didn't take long for me to really warm up to the game. Essentially, things boil down to you trying to escape the park by navigating your way around the island. You start off near the power generator, go through the visitor center, around the shore, and finally back to the helipad where you eventually make your escape. There's a fair bit of backtracking around the island to finish the various side objectives, but the island itself isn't super big, so it never got too boring. Probably the biggest problem with getting around the island is getting lost, especially if it's your first time playing the game. A lot of the island can be very maze-like, and if you don't know the exact route, you'll probably hit a dead end full of raptors. There's also no in-game island map, so you better get out the graph paper for this one if you want to make your own. Once you figure out your way through though, you can breeze through the overhead map and get to the dungeons in no time, which is where the game takes a dramatic turn in just about every single way. As soon as you enter a dungeon, which is like the power shed or the visitor center, the game went into a full-on first-person shooter mode. Now keep in mind this was at a time where anything that even resembled 3D on a home console was considered nothing short of a miracle. So it was pretty amazing the first time you walk into a building and the perspective changes to you staring down a raptor. Of course that raptor was the crudest 2D bitmap you've ever seen in a video game, but it didn't matter. It was really awesome, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't fall back out of my chair the first time one of them actually lunged at me. But once you got over the initial shock of the view change, you realized pretty quickly you'd probably rather go back to playing the overhead view instead. Moving in these areas was like trying to guide a semi-truck through a hallway, and trying to shoot the dinosaurs in them was even worse due to just how slow it was to line up your shot. Thankfully, the developers seemed to recognize this since these areas are all pretty easy. The dinosaurs in them just kinda stand in place and watch, patiently waiting for you to blow them apart as soon as you could finally line up a shot to do so. And pretty much all the dungeons themselves just kinda boil down to finding a keycard to open a new area so you can continue on. Some of these areas could be a bit long, but overall it was such a neat gimmick that, well, I just really didn't care at the time. The only real issue with Jurassic Park is that there's no save feature at all. No battery backup or even a password feature is present in this one. That meant you had to beat the entire game in one sitting on a few lives and a couple of continues. This was absolutely brutal, as the game can eventually get pretty tough. Also, it's not a short game at all. It could take 3 to 4 hours to complete even if you know exactly where to go and what to do. I never managed to beat the game as a kid, and I always blamed not having a save feature because of it. I actually still do, since I would love to play through the entire thing finally, but I just don't have the patience these days to do so in one giant playthrough. Yes, I know about save states and emulators, but I'd rather play through it as intended on the actual Super NES. Overall though, Jurassic Park on the Super NES was a really cool game. The overhead stuff worked great and had just enough action and exploration to keep you interested. And the first person stuff, while clumsy, was totally playable and atmospheric for the time. If you never checked out Jurassic Park on the Super NES or was put off by the fact that it wasn't a run and gun shooter, I still think it's worth looking into if you're a Jurassic Park fan at all. Even if you don't feel like playing through the entire game at once, it's still a fun little game while it can keep your attention. I'd still highly recommend checking it out even today because it's a really fun game, especially for a Jurassic Park game. Truth be told, I never gave the Sega Genesis much of a chance as a kid. I always considered myself a Nintendo kid since those were the systems I owned. But when I finally got around to getting a Genesis late in its life cycle, I was genuinely shocked at just how many games I was missing out on that were only on the Genesis. My all-time favorite easily being World of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse. Yes, I'm aware that Castle of Illusion is the one that everyone loves, but I never got to play that game as a kid. Instead, World of Illusion had just arrived at my video store, and I was more than happy to try it out. World of Illusion has you choosing either Donald Duck or Mickey Mouse to set off on a super magical journey through wherever they are. It's never really explained. I guess Mickey and Donald were doing a magic show and the evil Pete decided that instead of killing them right then and there, he should send them off to a magical world where they have to work together to escape. I guess it makes sense if you're a Disney fan, but honestly it didn't matter since the story's just there so the developers could make some super cool levels. And they did just that. World of Illusion impresses the minute you start playing with some really great graphics. And not like great for Genesis graphics either. The game just looks amazing. It just goes to show what the Genesis could do when developers knew how to use the limited color palette that the Genesis had. Every stage pops with an unforgettable look that I can still picture to this day even without playing the game for years. And while the characters may not have been as animated as something like Aladdin on the Genesis, they still looked great and had a ton of variety in what animations they do have throughout the game. Needless to say, the game looked amazing, and I would still argue that it's one of the best looking Genesis games ever made. But any game can look amazing and quickly get turned off if it plays like a turd, right? Thankfully, World of Illusion mostly delivers in the gameplay department as well. Mickey and Donald are basically the same character, and can run and jump with the best of them, though they kind of have a floaty feel to them when they jump. You attack by using your magic blanket, which will cause enemies close to it to turn into a dove or a playing card. Get it? Like magic? Whatever. Personally, I would have rather been able to jump on enemies like in Castle of Illusion, since using the blanket never feels satisfying like you want it to. The game also uses the magic theme in other ways as well. Like, once you beat a boss of the stage, you get a new magic power that you'll be able to use in the next stage, like flying on a magic carpet or swimming in a bubble. Unfortunately, you can't use these powers when you want to, and it just sort of happens when the game decides to use them. It also doesn't change how the game is really played, besides a couple of small parts in the game. It's just a different way of moving forward. I guess if you're going to base a game around magic, you gotta use it somehow, but I just wish it added more to the actual gameplay. For the most part, all of this makes the game fun enough by yourself, but the game really shines in the gameplay department when you get a friend to play with you. Once you get 2 players in the game, things actually change a good deal. The game now requires you and your friend to work together to get past the stages by working cooperatively. You'll need to do things like use your friend to jump up to higher ledges, then pull them up using a rope. There's also a part where you have to time your jumps on a minecart to move, and even parts of the stages where the 2 of you are separated and have to advance using each other's help. It's pretty neat to actually have a cooperative game that made you, cooperate, instead of just tossing in another player with no rhyme or reason. The game even went so far as to completely change the layout of some stages to make cooperative play necessary to progress that wasn't there when you played the single player. This is what I remember most about the game, and it's still fun to play with a friend even today. So with all this praise, World of Illusion must be the best game ever, right? Well, no. The game has some unfortunate issues all over the place. The aforementioned movement of the characters never quite feel right, especially when trying to make precise jumps. Also, the game's super easy, providing no challenge until the very last boss, and even he isn't that hard. The lack of challenge definitely hurts when you realize the game is pretty short as well. You can easily beat it in about 40 minutes since you can just blow past enemies and bosses with little issue. I know the game was probably targeted at kids, but even as a kid I thought the game was too easy. But I guess it was fun while it lasted, and it was always fun to pull out when friends came over back then. Even with its flaws, World of Illusion is still one of my favorite Genesis games ever. It was everything that I'd wanted in a Disney game on the Super NES, but I never got. It also showed me that I should definitely take a much closer look at the games I may have been missing on the Sega Genesis. From that day forward, the Genesis wasn't the system off to the side collecting dust. Instead, it proudly sat right next to the Super NES, usually with a copy of World of Illusion in it. Congo's Caper was released back in 1992 on the Super NES, and is one of those games I've always considered to be a huge disappointment. And not so much because it's a terrible game. It's not. It's actually pretty okay. But Congo's Caper first showed up in magazines as a sequel to Joe and Mac, which was one of my favorite games at the time. The Japanese version of the game is actually called Joe and Mac 2, Congo's Caper, so I just figured this was going to be more Joe and Mac, just bigger and better. That turned out not to be the case at all, as Congo's Caper barely has anything to do with Joe and Mac, and in turn made for a fairly disappointing weekend rental. As soon as you start the game, you'll realize that this is only Joe and Mac in the absolute loosest of ways. Joe and Mac are nowhere to be seen, and instead you play as a half monkey, half kid that's on a journey to save his monkey girlfriend from whoever kidnapped her. So what does it have from Joe and Mac? Well, the enemies are the only real thing that make a direct return from the first game, as you'll be fighting the same cavemen that only seem to know how to walk back and forth endlessly until you see fit to end their incredibly monotonous video game lives. And at least the game is still set in the same world as Joe and Mac, so you'll see plenty of dinosaurs in fairly varied stages thanks to all the wonders that prehistoric times brings with it. But that's about where any similarities with Joe and Mac ends. The rest of the game is all Congo all the time, and that's really unfortunate. Playing Congo's Caper is a pretty simple affair. You'll be doing standard platforming to make it through the various prehistoric stages with very little to separate it from the thousands of other platformers that were available at the time. Congo attacks with his club, but it has a fairly short reach that can result in a lot of missed attacks. If you do manage to hit an enemy, they'll become stunned, which at this point allows you to push them forward and other enemies, or you can jump on top of their head for a super jump. But both of these moves are fairly useless on their own, and really only come into play when the game forces you to use them. For example, the first boss can only be defeated by rolling enemies at him, which can be annoying due to just how accurate you have to be pressing the buttons to even initiate the roll itself. Besides situations like that, you'll probably only be using the roll and the jump moves to find hidden areas or bonus stages, of which the game has a good deal of. But even then, there's nothing fun to find other than gems or extra lives, so it's generally best to stick with Congo's 4-inch long club and hope for the best. Even if fighting isn't Congo's best ability, he can at least count on his monkey talents to get the edge over enemies, right? Well, sort of. Being a monkey and all allows Congo to do a few monkey-like moves in some stages, like hanging from tree branches to navigate around trees, or jumping higher than anything else can. But besides that, the whole monkey theme seems to just be thrown in with no real reason. Congo does turn into a monkey when he gets hit, but it doesn't change gameplay any. You just look like a cute monkey for a bit until you get hit again and die, or find a crystal to change you back. It seems like a missed opportunity to set Congo apart from other games. Instead, we're left with a gimmick that has zero effect on the game at all. So don't count on Congo's monkeyness to get you through levels any easier than if he wasn't a monkey at all. Ultimately though, Congo's Caper just isn't very fun. Even taking away that it has nothing to do with Joe and Mac, it's still just a bog standard platformer. Nothing really stands out, and even the whole turning into a monkey when you get hit is little more than Mario shrinking when he gets hit. And it gets even worse when you do start comparing it to Joe and Mac, as it loses all the charm and fun that game had. Hell, the first stage of Joe and Mac offered more variety and cool things going on than Congo offers up throughout the entire game. It even threw out the 2-player co-op mode that made Joe and Mac so much more fun, and that by itself is almost unforgivable. Looking back, it was probably smart that the US release took the Joe and Mac 2 title completely off the game. But the damage was already done to anyone who had read previews about the game in magazines and saw Joe and Mac 2 mentioned countless times. I guess if I had never known what Congo's Caper was supposed to be, I would have just marked it up as another basic Super NES side-scroller and probably wouldn't have ever regretted playing it. But having Joe and Mac constantly sitting in the back of my head while playing doomed Congo's Caper from the minute that I pressed start. Still though, I never quite forgot about Congo even after all these years, and I was hoping that coming back to it now and taking it for what it is, I might enjoy it more than I did back then. But even on its own merits, Congo's Caper is still just a poor man's Joe and Mac. And when a game's best asset is to make you want to play the better game, it's hard to come away saying that it's anything more than a disappointment. Rolling Thunder 2 for the Sega Genesis was definitely a surprise pickup for me as a kid. I had barely heard anything about it from gaming magazines, and it just sort of seemed to show up at my video store one day out of nowhere. I decided to take a chance on it, which is usually how I end up playing the worst games I've ever played. Thankfully though, Rolling Thunder 2 was anything but terrible, and would end up becoming one of my favorite action games ever. Rolling Thunder 2 is all about being super cool James Bond-like spies that have been sent on a secret mission to take down the evil Geldra organization. Apparently some satellites were destroyed and somehow sent the world into chaos. Now it's up to you to save the world by infiltrating their base and taking Geldra down once and for all. The story's obviously terrible in the best ways possible, and it's got that late 80s anime charm to it that makes it even more fun. The game doles out the story through cinematics between stages, letting you know what's going on or where you're going next, and it was always fun to see just what the game could dream up to throw at you next. Once you're done laughing at the plot, you'll get to take control of your spy. At this point, it's pretty obvious that this isn't going to be a stealth mission. No, instead of using your super spy skills of infiltration and subterfuge, you'll be dealing with the bad guys by shooting them in the face over and over again until you've successfully murdered everyone in the Geldra organization. It may not be the most delicate way of dealing with the problem, but it's hard to argue with in terms of effectiveness. Also, this is a video game from the 90s, so you can bet your ass you'll be shooting things. That's okay though, since shooting things in Rolling Thunder 2 is super fun to do, due to just how the gunfights actually work in the game. Instead of a bullet hell game like Contra, Rolling Thunder 2 has a bit of a slower pace. Enemies will generally use cover behind boxes or inside doors, forcing you to use a bit of strategy yourself when dealing with them. Most enemies will be content to just duck behind a box and hope you run into their bullets. Others will actually try to get behind you while you're dealing with enemies in the front, so you have to constantly stay aware of what's happening around you, since only a couple of hits from an enemy will take you down. Your main weapon is a pistol that can only shoot one bullet at a time, so you have to time your shots to be effective with it. You can't even just sit back and dump bullets all over the screen like in other shooters, since you can actually run out of ammo completely. Doing so leaves you with a pistol that jams constantly and is essentially worthless. You can also find better guns throughout the game, including a machine gun, a flamethrower, and a fairly awesome laser shotgun. All of these guns use ammo as well though, so don't get too used to having them around for very long. The stages themselves also play into the action with their multi-floor design. You'll generally always have a second floor above you that you can instantly jump up to if you need to escape when things get too hairy down below. Using the multiple floors to your advantage is vital in progressing in the game, as it gives you the ability to make your own route throughout the stage, as well as escaping gunfire. If you stick to one floor, you'll probably be overwhelmed pretty quickly, so be sure to use those extra floors to your advantage. Once you figure out how to get around the stages, you'll find that those doors you go into and out of to take cover are also your main way of getting power-ups. This is where you find things like better guns, or those ever-important health pickups. Most doors are marked with what they contain, though health pickups are only in unmarked doors, which means it's always important to check each door you come across, even if it gets a bit tedious doing so. If you don't, you'll quickly find yourself constantly out of health and ammo, with no hope of getting to the later stages in the game. And all of this is pretty damn fun on your own, but it gets even better with two-player co-op. Once a friend jumps in, they take on the role of the female spy, which is essentially the same as the male spy, but dressed in a super fabulous outfit. Having two players now allows you to divide and conquer the multiple floors, making for a much easier time dealing with the enemies. It's always fun to watch each other's backs, and being able to flank the enemies is a strategy that the single-player game is completely missing. Co-op is definitely the way to go in Rolling Thunder 2, but it's still a great game if you can't manage to find anyone to play with you. There are a few things here and there that keep Rolling Thunder 2 from being perfect. I already mentioned that you have to keep searching doorways to find ammo, which can slow things down a bit. It is an action game after all, and constantly checking rooms for stuff isn't what you want to do in the middle of a firefight. Also, some of the levels drag on for what seems like way too long, while others only take a few minutes. This makes for some weird pacing throughout the game by making some levels more tedious to endure than others. The bosses in the game are mostly weak as well, and seem out of place for the most part. They're usually super frustrating and not fun at all. Honestly, I think the game would have been better without them. The biggest problem, however, is the difficulty. Rolling Thunder 2 was originally an arcade game, so it was made to eat quarters by being brutally difficult, and it continues doing just that on the Genesis. It can be really frustrating. The worst part is just how quickly the difficulty spikes. You can be making decent progress, taking out enemies left and right, and then bam, you hit a spot in a stage that will absolutely destroy you, over and over and over again, mainly due to cheap enemy placement and one-hit kills. Speaking of cheap enemies, the game's full of them. panthers pounce from off screen, these fuckers sit here and roll grenades at you over and over again, and then you get these guys that hide in the shadows and pop out with a super quick blast that kills you in one hit. It can easily make you lose your mind. The game even gives you 40 lives to start the game with, and I guarantee you'll use half of them before stage 3, if you even make it to stage 3 before you throw your Genesis out the window. Even with those problems, I still loved Rolling Thunder 2. It was a nice change of pace from the craziness of shooters like Contra, and using the whole awesomely lame Super Spy storyline was something that made it stand out even more in my eyes. Also, if you want some great 2-player co-op, you can't go wrong with this one. Unfortunately, Rolling Thunder 2 seemed to get buried underneath all the other more popular games coming out for the Genesis, and it's a shame more people never got around to playing it. So do yourself a favor and check out Rolling Thunder 2 if you get the chance. Geldra isn't going to go down without your help. Zombies Ate My Neighbors is definitely an all-time favorite game of mine. I can't possibly count how many times me and my cousins sat down to go through Dr. Tongue's gauntlet of fright-filled stages. It never got old, and I still consider it one of my top 5 games to this day. Some games just don't age well at all, but Zombies Ate My Neighbors, like its many undead monsters in the game, continues to live on as one of the best action games ever made, no matter what system you play it on. Zombies Ate My Neighbors is a fairly simple game. You choose to play as either Zeke or Julie and then immediately get tossed into the game. There's no plot or exposition to be found here, which is fine by me. The game doesn't need any. You just need to accept that B-movie monsters have overrun your town, and the fewer questions you ask, the better. Once you're in the game, the goal is to search the level for your clueless neighbors, who don't seem to care at all that zombies and werewolves are running rampant around town. All you need to do is get to them before the monsters do to save you. Every level has a set number of neighbors to rescue, which is kept track of beneath your map. Rescue all the neighbors you can, and the stage ends once you save the last neighbor, or they meet their untimely demise at the hand of a monster that got there before you did. The game doesn't really punish you though for neighbors getting killed, unless all the neighbors die in a level, which gets you a big fat game over screen. And if you manage that, I'm not entirely sure what you're doing, since you should come across at least one neighbor without even trying. Once you finish a level, your score is tallied up, giving you a big score bonus if you save all the neighbors in a level. After that, it's on to the next level where you do it all again. But running around and saving your neighbors from horrific monsters is gonna take some serious firepower, and the game gives you more than you'll probably ever need. Your standard weapon is your trusty squirt gun, which can take out most enemies in the game without too much effort. You'll also find a ton of other weapons laying around the levels as well, including shaken up soda cans that are used as grenades, weed whackers, popsicles, and the ever-useful rocket launcher. There are actually tons more as well, but most of them are fairly useless compared to just using your squirt gun. The only one that's consistently worth having around is the rocket launcher, which lets you blow up walls to make shortcuts through the levels. The other weapons are more fun to use for a laugh or two, or when you really need to throw the kitchen sink at a boss. Most of the time though, they'll just pile up in your inventory until you remember you even have them. Your secondary item slot is much more useful though. This is where things like health packs, potions, and other random stuff that isn't a weapon go. Having a spare health pack around is always suggested, and the other items like decoys can turn a super frustrating stage into a cakewalk. You can also find potions that turn you into a rampaging monster for a few seconds, allowing you to run around punching enemies in the face with wild abandon. The variety in items is really great, since you honestly never know what you'll come across next, but you can always bet it'll at least be fun to use. As mentioned before, the stages in the game are fairly maze-like, some more so than others. But it never gets too boring to explore since you never know what hidden room or passage you'll come across that could be right around the next corner. You can always see what path you need to find to get to the neighbors, and it generally only takes a second or two to get to where you need to go. And as mentioned before, you can use the rocket launcher to brute force your way through a stage if you get stuck. Unfortunately though, there are a few stages here and there that can definitely be more frustrating than fun due to what enemies occupy that level. But thankfully none of these stages ever get too large, where you feel like you're just completely lost. And there's always enough variety in the level design to keep you interested, stage after stage. So just when you get tired of searching through a suburban neighborhood, you'll find yourself in the mall the next stage, or an old castle, or even the pyramid. usually with their own unique enemies in tow. It's always fun to see what's next, and even after 40 plus levels, you'll still be seeing new things. It also doesn't hurt that the game looks great, with its stylized art being some of the best ever put into a game. Everything has a simple but charming cartoon look to it that allows the humor in the game to really shine through. And did I mention that you get to listen to one of the best game soundtracks of all time while you're doing all this? Well, you do, and it's completely awesome. While Zombies Ate My Neighbors is a really great game, it still has a few issues here and there. The aforementioned variety in weapons and pickups is nice and all, but it quickly builds up in your inventory. And you can only cycle forward through items one at a time. So if you suddenly need to use a health pack quickly, you're probably out of luck if you have to cycle through more than a few things to get to it. Same goes for weapons, at times having to go through a dozen or more things to get to the weapon that you want. And if you're surrounded by enemies while you're trying to cycle through endless shit to get to what you want, the frustration meter goes up exponentially. This is even worse on the Genesis version of the game, since instead of dedicated buttons for cycling items like on the Super Nintendo, you have to press A and B together, or A and C together to select things. It can be maddening at times. Another issue are the bosses. They're mostly terrible and frustrating due to their erratic movements and the sheer amount of ammo it takes to bring them down. None of them are ever fun, and beating them only brings a sigh of relief instead of cries of victory. Thankfully, there's only a few bosses in the entire game, but it was a missed chance to make them a showpiece for the game, instead of the annoyances that they are. Obviously, Zombies Ate My Neighbors is an all-time classic on whatever you choose to play it on. There's so much variety and character in the game that it's hard not to love, especially if you're a fan of classic 50s and 60s monster movies. And it's even better when you bring a friend in with you for some two-player co-op. Zombies Ate My Neighbors is still fun to this day, and if you've never played it, you owe it to yourself to try it out if you're a fan of older games. Dr. Tongue may have built 45 levels of terror and fright for you, but you'll never have more fun being this scared.